Blaine, congratulations on the publication of this book, Camp 14. It's right here. It's an extraordinary book. For those of you in the audience who have not read it, Escape from Camp 14 is a compelling and harrowing account of the life and experience of Shin Dong-hyuk. Shin was born, lived, and eventually escaped from a North Korean political prison labor camp. And of course, Blaine's book serves as the jumping off point for our discussion this evening about a side of North Korea that's not often discussed. Though North Korea, as we know, is often in the media, particularly as of late, most attention is given to the country's nuclear weapons, its missiles, its military, its authoritarian and probably peculiar leadership. As a former State Department official, I can say that focus on the military was definitely the case when I was in government. I think people also broadly know that North Korea is essentially an economic basket case, a place of chronic food shortages. Depending on the source that you consult, between 500,000 and 3 million people are thought to have died from famine or famine-related causes in the 1990s. The North officially gave the number of deaths during the 1990s as 200,000. Even now, there is little doubt that many in North Korea are still going hungry. But when it comes to human rights in North Korea, there's less certainty. I believe it's safe to say that people probably know that the human rights situation in North Korea is not very good, but very few people are aware that North Korea has 6 Soviet-style labor camps scattered across the nation, and that in a country of 24 million people, the North Korean government holds an estimated 200,000 prisoners in these camps, all of whom are subject to incredible abuses. So with this as background and context, I thought we would start our conversation. So the first question, Blaine, is, as we move forward, is just sort of tell the audience how you got interested in North Korea to begin with, and how you got interested in telling the story of Shin Dong-hyuk.
I was sent to Tokyo, where I was living, basically to write about North Korea. My boss at the Washington Post said, we've sent other reporters there. They say they'll cover North Korea, and they don't. The reason they don't is because it's hard. You can't go there if you're an American. If you do go, you're followed around and you don't learn much. And it's just very difficult to write stories that are fresh and human about a place that you can't go to. I went there for 3 days with the New York Philharmonic on a very strange, interesting,
yes,
but fundamentally useless trip for trying to figure out what's going on in North Korea. So what I did is I took my boss's advice and I tried to find people in South Korea. What's really interesting, in the past 12, 15 years, about 24,000 North Korean defectors have come to South Korea. They are the best source of information there is about life in that country. In general, they're a nutty bunch. And the reason I use that term is there's a resettlement center in South Korea called Hanawon. And every North Korean who comes goes through this place. And they teach them how to drive, how to go to a bank, how to use a credit card, how to get some of the basics for living in a modern technological society. I talked to a psychologist there, a couple, and they said that they think it's fair to describe every single North Korean who comes to South Korea as clinically paranoid. And they say it's a useful adaptation in a country full of snitches, but it's not very useful once you try to make a life in South Korea. So those 24,000 individuals exist as this enormous resource for journalists, scholars, human rights investigators, if they're willing to talk and if they'll tell a coherent story, if they're capable and willing to tell a coherent story. I had the great good fortune in December 2012 to be set up for a lunch with Shin Dong-hyuk in Seoul, and it was the most extraordinary meeting. He is a handsome, and as I learned over the years of interviewing him, an extraordinarily intelligent young man with a very, very precise memory of things that happened in his life. So we had this lunch, and he ate voraciously at lunch, which he did at all the meals. He did his best talking when he ate. And so that's where I got most of the information. We ate a lot of meals together. But he told me this awful story about watching his mother being executed and being glad she was killed and refusing to catch her eye when he watched her being hanged in the camp. And the story it broke my heart, and it also seemed impossible. Right. It didn't square with anything I'd ever understood. And I'd covered a lot of nasty things in Africa and in Eastern Europe. I just didn't know how to have a common connection with this young guy. But in any case, I wrote this piece about him and his life in the camp as the only known person born and bred in a camp to escape. And the reaction was overwhelming, and actually probably more than anything I wrote in 28 years at the Washington Post. We got letters, we got emails with people offering money, prayers. A couple from Columbus, Ohio wanted to adopt him, in fact did. Right. The Dyes family, Lowell and Linda Dye, they sent him money that brought him to the United States, and he lived here for a couple of years. That story touched people in a way that I wasn't aware of when I wrote it. And a couple of my friends said, this is a good story. You should go back to Shin and see if he'll agree to do a book. Mm-hmm. And I did. And I went back, and he said no. Okay. And he said no because he doesn't trust me. He doesn't trust journalists. Journalists have always taken his story, betrayed him, gotten benefit from it, and he gets nothing. So it took 9 months of abject begging on my part. But more effective than the begging was the intercession of human rights groups who were helping Shin keep life and limb together because he'd run out of money in Seoul. They were giving him money to live. And they said, look, if you participate in this book, your story can go in English to the United States and to Europe, and it can really, really change things because your story is unique. And finally, he agreed to do it. And we also agreed from the get-go that we would split 50-50, any money that we would make. And I said, there's not going to be any money. Right. But he was impressed that we did get a book advance, and he got the money, and that did make a big difference, a very big difference to him in his willingness to cooperate in the book. But then we started working on it, and I remember going to the first set of interviews, and I sat outside a very costly week for me in a hotel in Seoul. And one day he came in, and he said, I don't feel right. And he just left.
And just left.
And so it was extremely difficult to get him to tell his story. It's like trying to catch clouds with a spoon.
So when you were talking with, you obviously met a lot of sort of people who defected and came to South Korea. Can you sort of give us a sense, and Shin was somewhat extraordinary in his own way. Can you give us a sense how you compare, comparison of what maybe the average sort of defector when he comes to South Korea and what their demeanor is and what they're like and the things that they go through compared to, in a sense, Shin and his story?
Yeah. Well, the average, if there can be an average North defector, because they're pretty extraordinary people to have the courage to leave. Yeah. So they're all exceptional in one way or another, although they tend to be rather poorly educated and not very articulate. Traders, women, and their young children are the primary numbers of the defectors now. In fact, they're overwhelmingly women at this point. So they are clinically paranoid, which makes them very reluctant to talk truthfully about their lives. But if you can get past that, which takes time, lots of time, they are, they will never speak ill of at that time Kim Jong-il was still alive. They would never say a contrary word about the great leader or the dear leader. They were still afraid. But they had families. They had children. They loved their children.
Yes.
They had parents maybe back in North Korea very worried about. So they had a lot of the sort of interstitial tissue of being a human being. They just had all this. They had family. They had they had read books and they knew things. They were normal people in a certain sense. And Shin was in another category. He didn't know the world was round until he was 23 years old, and someone broke the news to him.
We'll point out how, when we read the book, that was the thing that was interesting, how Shin was very different in certain ways from a lot of the defectors that had come because of where he was born and where he came from, right?
Let me explain just a bit about why Shin is so important to understand, more than just as an interesting human being. He brings really news about how these camps work. His parents were chosen by guards. The guards were his teachers, but they were also his breeders. They selected his parents and forced them to have sex. He had an older brother, 8 years older. His mother and father were allowed to sleep together about 5 times a year. He barely knew his father, and he had a most extraordinarily combative relationship with his mother. He would steal her lunch whenever he could. If she was gone from this little room that they lived in, he would eat her lunch if he could. She would come home from working in the fields, and she would beat him up. And this went on for years. She would beat him up with a hoe or a shovel, and some of the worst beatings of his life. And he got a lot of bad beatings from guards. The worst beatings of his life came when he was a toddler from his mother. So his relationship to his family and to his brother, who was a very distant figure, was unlike we know these relationships to be. I mean, when I first started asking him about his mother, he had a different concept of mother than I did. And it took me a long time to get my head around that. With his classmates, all of the children that he went to school with were, like him, the fruit of this guard-chosen breeding. And they were bred basically to be slaves and to work themselves to death over a period of 40 to 50 years. They went to a school and learned very rudimentary skills in reading and writing, adding and subtracting. He never learned to multiply. And to this day, he doesn't know how to multiply. And the reason he was taught basic literacy, because it came in handy in some of the jobs in the factories in this big camp. The Camp 14, right in the center of North Korea, about 50 miles north of Pyongyang, 30 miles long, 15 miles wide, right on the banks of the Taedong River. And it has factories for military uniforms, for pottery. There's a pig farm, other agriculture, and other manufacturing things. So a bit of education is very useful in a slave in those camps. And he really had no notion of what was going on outside the fence, and particularly interesting, no interest. Just no interest at all. None of the people that he talked to knew the world outside the camp, except for his parents, and their knowledge was attenuated by time, and they were always exhausted from work in the camp. Food and sleep are very interesting issues. He ate the same meal every day for 23 years. Corn, cabbage, salt in a kind of soup. And that was the meal, along with animals they could capture, rats and berries and other stuff in this camp, which is pretty rural. So that's what they ate. And sleep, they got up at 4:30 in the morning and worked till dark every day, and then had meetings to impose ideological purity, self-criticism meetings at night. And they rarely got to sleep before 11. And so he was chronically exhausted. He did not get rid of body lice that he had body lice until he went to China in 23. He had them for 23 years until he left the country. So that's sort of his context.
Okay, so I'm sure that there are going to be more questions from the audience about Shin in particular. I thought I'd take a subtle shift a little bit. Let's talk about the camps in general, which you started to talk about in the previous answer. In your mind, what makes these camps significant? Why are they so important or significant in terms of the reporting that you've done? And does the continued existence of these camps have anything to do with the long survival of North Korea as a totalitarian state?
Yeah, I think that they are one of the building blocks, one of the pillars that hold up the totalitarian system. There are many others. There's a pervasive secret police presence in the country with lots of snitches who are rewarded for turning in perceived disloyalty. People know that the camps exist. They know that if they speak ill of the government, there's a chance that they could go there. The policy that Kim Il-sung created, it was punishment unto 3 generations. So if I were to say that Kim Jong-un is fat, stupid, and incompetent, my children and my parents and me would have the secret police come in the middle of the night, take us all away to Camp 14 or one of the other camps, and we would be worked to death there, all of us. So there are 150 to 200,000 people in the camps, so 24 million people in the country. So not everybody goes to the camps, obviously, but they're aware that that's a possibility. And there are other iterations of this kind of oppression in other kinds of camps that are less formalized, that people can be victimized of. And so what this does is it atomizes society based on fear. There's no civil society. There's no genuine conversation about politics or about the human condition in that country for fear of a snitch and fear of ending up in a place like Camp 14. So they're very important in the terror that sustains totalitarianism.
Okay. So, I mean, you're a longtime reporter. You've been in amazing and very difficult places. I know that reporters in generally like to think of themselves as hardened and not surprised, inherently skeptical. Yeah. What about you heard about the camps that genuinely kind of threw you off, just sort of disoriented you? It was something that you just found just utterly unbelievable that you felt that you ended up sort of verifying.
Verifying.
Well, end up
that's
believing.
Another question.
Yes, that's another question we'll ask
a
little bit, because that's a major thing that I know that some of the audience will be interested to hear. But for you, something that you feel in your gut that this is actually true.
I think that it's in Shin's story that he watched his mother hang and refused to catch her eye because he hated her so much, and that the camp had bred that out of him, that he was no longer a human being as we understand it, with the love of his own mother and empathy towards her or towards anyone. He was solely interested in his own survival. And he made that clear because he's articulate and because, in some ways, he was proud of his survival. And then something that came out in the course of the interviews, and this is really the heart of the book, and I think it's one of the most disturbing things that I've ever heard about these stories of the camps, is that a year after we started the interviews, we were in Southern California in Torrance, just south of LA. And he said, there's something I've been lying to you about what kind of person I was in the camp. When he arrived in South Korea after fleeing across China, he told the Korean intelligence people and then human rights people, and then he put it in a little book that he wrote, and he told all the journalists, including me, a story that wasn't true. And the story that he told was that he had awakened one morning to learn that his brother had tried to escape, and that he was taken to an underground prison inside Camp 14 and tortured to get information about what he knew about this plan. He survived that, and then his mother and brother were executed in front of him. So that's what he had said. What really happened, what he told me in this hotel room in Torrance, California, a year after our interviews, and we'd been working on this for a year, and I'd done a lot of work, and he said, there's something I lied about. It's very important. He said that he was the one who turned in his mother. He'd heard them talking one night about escape. And once he heard the word, his heart started to pound, and all of the teaching he'd learned from the guards kicked in. There were rules in the camp, and the first rule of the camp is if you do not escape, and if you try, you'll be shot immediately. If you hear someone talking about escape and you fail to report it, you will be shot immediately. That's what he thought about when he heard them talk about escape. So he turned them in. Okay. And he was then responsible for their death. And he had not told anybody that until he told me. And when he told me that, then I just didn't know. I mean, it was emotionally, intellectually sort of overwhelming. But it made sense for who he was. Okay. And that was the darkest moment, I think.
A question that I think people, when they read this, when they first started out and hear, again, when they hear these stories, and you talk about this at the beginning of the book very upfront, and that's what I found very, very compelling about it as well, is that you admit in the end, fact-checking on this is virtually impossible. And this is something that journalists always have to do in the way they do stuff. Yeah. So I'm sure this was a little bit difficult for you. It was very difficult for you as you move forward. And as you just talked about, that Shin lied in his initial story. So why do you trust him now, or do you trust him now? It sounds like you do. And what made you feel like you could go forward with the story after he told you that he had lied?
Yeah, well, there are many layers to this. I feel like Shrek, there are layers, like a parfait. I think the most important thing is that David Hawk, who is a human rights investigator, has been working on this issue for about 12 years. And he's now interviewed more than 60 people who've been in the camps. And the Korean Law Society has also interviewed everyone from the camps who's been willing to talk. And they've written it all up, and they've compared and correlated and contrasted all of the things that all these people have had to say over the past 10 years. And they've also talked to Shin in depth, having the experience of all these other interviews. And I talked to 4 people who were in Camp 15 and a guard who was in 4 other camps. And in between my conversations. And Shin's story is very much of a piece with all those other stories. He knows things that would be impossible to know had you not been in the camps. So that was sort of the beginning. I guess the second thing is now that the satellite imagery of the camps has become more detailed with each passing year. Shin has annotated his camp, as have the other people from other camps, particularly Camp 15, where people can go and then come out after 2 to 10 years. And his annotation of the camp, as I went over it, and with Google Earth, you can literally skate through the camp. It is so consistent. The buildings, everything's so consistent with the story he tells. So there's physical evidence that's begun to emerge. And then there's Shin's own body, terribly scarred. He was tortured when he was 13 in the wake of his mother's escape plot. And his back is burned in a most terrible and bizarre way. He climbed, when he escaped from the camp, he moved through an electric fence over the body of a person he was escaping with, who died on the fence. But his legs slipped off, and he received these horrible high-voltage burns on the front of his legs from knee to ankle. And the scars are just terrifying to see. His ankles, he was hung upside down when he was tortured, and his ankles bear the most alarming scars. And then his finger was chopped off when he accidentally dropped a sewing machine, when he was repairing sewing machines in a factory. And as punishment, they chopped off his finger in the first knuckle very quickly. So these are the sort of things that you don't see on a normal body, a normal person, and they're all very consistent, precisely consistent with the story that he tells. And then finally, the last layer of the parfait has actually come since the book came out. And 60 Minutes is doing a piece about Shin right now, and they've been trying to check because they don't want to be hung out to dry with the person who's making up a story. So they've gone to South Korea and talked to intelligence people and were satisfied that Shin had told the same story when he originally came as he's telling now. Right. And I was speaking in Northern Virginia, not far from the CIA, at the Arlington Library a couple weeks ago. And a mom came up to me afterwards and said, my son interviewed Shin. My son worked for Army intelligence. And her son had interviewed Shin just a few days after he arrived in the country and about 3 days after he'd talked to...
This is South Korea.
In South Korea,
okay.
After he'd talked to South Korean intelligence. And they spent a long session together. And so I called him up and said, this is the story. How does it square with the book and what he told you? And he said, everything that he said is completely consistent. He has exaggerated nothing over the time that he's been out from the story he originally told, except for this lie about his mother. Okay. So all of that together, and I still can't say that it's verifiable because you can't go to North Korea. North Korea denies that these camps exist as political concentration camps. They deny everything. And David Hawk says, until they're willing to allow people to go and take a look, the testimony of the survivors stands, and that's what I believe.
Okay. Well, I've got questions from the audience, and actually they're fairly consistent with a couple of things that I have written that I'll sort of ask, and then we can go more specifically to some other questions. I'll say that when I read this book, for me personally, it was uncomfortable. It was very uncomfortable for two reasons. The first was, as a former government official, I understand that governments and nations often have to make hard choices and as they balance competing interests when it's related to peace, when it's related to war, existential issues. Nuclear weapons happens to be one of them. And that oftentimes trumps other very important issues. I also note that as a practical matter, again, from a government official's background, there's little that the international community has shown that it can do or willing to do to stop North Korea from doing something that it's determined to do. And so there was always this frustration on my part, understanding that this stuff was happening, that there was very little traction or ability for us to really affect something in a certain way. And so for you, after going through this experience, what would you recommend to the U.S. government, to the South Korean government, to the international community of governments, of nations, as to how to deal with this particular issue and maybe North Korea in general?
Well, to get Shin to participate in this, I had to deal with that question. He says, what's in it for me? I mean, what's in it for my friends back in Camp 14?
Yeah.
And I think that knowing is better than ignorance. And in the years that I was reporting and writing this book, I talked to a lot of well-informed Americans who did not know that the camps existed. And Shin and I, our primary goal was to change that, so they knew. And we've been more successful in that with the sales of the book in the United States and around the world than we thought we would be. And so that was the primary goal. And there's still a lot more to do in that to make people know. So that was accomplished. But in diplomatic conversations, as you know, and as your colleagues have told me, they just didn't talk about human rights with the North Koreans, right. In part because the North Koreans wouldn't stomach it.
Right.
They wouldn't
get up and they'd walk away.
They'd walk away. But what I told Shin and what I really believe is that, you have to talk about it. You have to make it part of every conversation You can't have long-range missiles. You can't have a nuclear program, or we want to talk about that. And we also want to talk about what you're doing to your people that violates our sacred values as a country. Mm-hmm. And we're not going to let you get away with not talking about this. And in the conversations with China, to make this a constant of any conversation about North Korea and a constant irritant to China. Not that it would change anything, but it just seems that it's better than not talking about it. Right. And it's a very unsatisfactory answer, but it's the only one that I've got.
Okay. So the second issue, or the second reason why this made me uncomfortable was that, as someone who has followed North Korea for a very long time myself, I have no doubt that North Korea at some point is going to change. It may even cease to exist. And the horrible truth of what actually has happening there or has happened there will come out. It could be more, worse than we could even imagine at this point in time. And in this circumstance, as a Korean American, personally, I feel that there's this obligation that I have to the future generations of the Korean diaspora, my children, and to myself, as to answering the question, what did you do when all this was happening? And this is something that, for me, has been with me for a very, very long time, as the issues of food and hunger and all the humanitarian issues that are occurring, and human rights in North Korea. And you make this point specifically, this point, but more broadly about humanity in general, in terms of what can they be doing, and how are we going to account ourselves to future generations as a whole. So in this audience here, we've got, again, a full room of close to 200 people. Why don't you elaborate on that and tell me what you think individuals can do specifically themselves to try to do what they can do?
Well, I think they could get well informed. And one of the things that can happen now with North Korea is there's just so much more information now than people think there is. It's possible to have real-time understanding of what's going on in North Korea on a daily basis, with blogs, English language newspapers, Korean newspapers that are published in English on the internet. There is an incredible information infrastructure if you're interested, and you can know what's going on. And people, so many reporters in these book interviews say it's such a great mystery. It's such a black hole, and in fact, that's not true. It's simply more clear every day what's going on. There are reporters in North Korea who periodically throw USB fobs across the Tumen River full of video and audio and written reports about food, human rights, agriculture, industrial. So there's all this information that's available out there. But living in the United States, I think you can also raise your voice. I mean, when there was a famine in Ethiopia in the 80s, and BBC sent a reporter and showed starving children, the upwelling of outrage and human feeling from the American population, you remember, we are the world, there was an incredible pressure put on the U.S. government to do something, and it reacted very quickly. There isn't good video from North Korea. They're very smart about that. Good video does not come out of there, the kind that would move people to disgust and a demand of action from people in Washington. But there is an increasing amount of information, so people can, get organized and lobby their members of Congress, particularly in California, places where there are, Southern California has, I think, the largest population of ethnic Koreans outside of the Korean Peninsula. There shouldn't be a member of Congress, south of San Jose. I don't that isn't well informed on these issues and leaning on the State Department to make this an important part of dealing with China and with North Korea. But again, the answer is not very satisfactory because China wants North Korea to exist. Otherwise, it wouldn't. Mm-hmm. And China is, happens to hold all our debt
right now.
It's a very messy human situation.
Yeah.
No simple answer.
Well, a lot of the questions that I've received pertain to sort of Shin directly.
Okay.
Okay, so let me go through some of these and get your response to them. One had to do about Shin lying and betraying his mother and sort of the psychology related that. If Shin didn't have an idea of our society's notion of love and motherhood, why do you think he lied about his mother? And what was the motivation in your mind for doing so?
That's a really good question. I think the answer why he lied when he got to South Korea is that he is smart. He is really smart, and he has this incredible situational intelligence to assess what the room wants. And it's the way he stayed alive, and it's the way he got through North Korea. When he got through that fence and escaped, he didn't know which way was north, but he managed to find his way out of the country in 30 days.
Yeah, talk about the things that he had to go through, yeah.
He is very, very sophisticated with antenna for understanding what you should say and when you should keep your mouth shut. And when he was about to come into South Korea, he'd been in the South Korean consulate in Shanghai for 6 months. He knew he was going to go to South Korea. He knew he was going to have to talk to intelligence people about his past. He knew that he would be an interesting character. He was getting some sense of how unique he was before he arrived in South Korea. And he told me the reason he lied is because he didn't want to be seen as some sort of monster. A monster who they might lock up. It just seemed like a classic Shin move of self-preservation. And that's why I lied. And the reason he told me about the lie is, I think, because he was starting to understand through the love that he felt from other Korean Americans in Torrance, California, who were feeding him, who were loving him up. Moms really liked to cook for this guy, and he just felt that these people didn't want anything from him, and he owed them the truth. And I think that's why he decided to tell the truth. And he also knew at that point that. Because he's so smart, he knew that the book was probably going to be read by a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And he felt that if he told the truth about the kind of dehumanized little boy they bred him to be, that there would be a more sophisticated understanding of what North Korea is up to and the real depravity of the state in doing that to its own children. And I think he's sophisticated enough, intelligent enough to understand all of that.
Okay. So let's talk about, on that end, people want to know, let's sort of shift a little bit to sort of his transition, so to speak, to the United States.
Right.
And one of the things that I will sort of co-opt a question here, you allude to Shin in the book calls himself an animal that's evolving. Yeah. Talk to the audience about that process with him and what you've seen and how he's changed a little bit more. Elaborate on that.
His time in the United States was pretty bumpy, and not unlike the experience of all North Koreans in South Korea or in the United States. They tend to have a hard time distinguishing between criticism and out-and-out betrayal. So he did not take advice very well. He broke with the group that had helped him the most in Southern California. And he was very mad, and he stormed away, left and ended up in Seattle, of all places, where I happen to live. He just could not get his head around the idea that people had brought him to the United States because of the power of his story, and they wanted him, for his own good, to do several things. They wanted him to get psychotherapy, which he refused to do. The only psychotherapy he got was a couple months in South Korea, and then the long interviews with me, which weren't psychotherapy at all. In fact, they were incredibly disturbing to him. And he said he frequently had nightmares from talking to me. He hated to see me coming because it was so painful for him. But so he refused. He really refused to get psychotherapy. He refused to learn English. He refused to get a better education. I mean, a lot of people had hopes that he would get a high school equivalency degree and then go to college. And all that was available to him in Southern California from the Korean community who were willing to give him anything. And he did not take advantage of all this opportunity because he felt he wasn't worthy, he didn't trust people, he would get angry. And that's why he says that he is still learning how to be a human being. He said when we were in London a couple weeks ago, he said that he thinks it'll take about 16 more years.
16 more years.
I don't know where he came up with that number, but he has made an enormous amount of progress since I met him in 2008. He has much more confidence. He's amazingly articulate. He still doesn't speak much English, although his English has improved quite a bit. And his emotional affect, his warmth, his ability to laugh and to understand when people are trying to help him has improved exponentially. Just in the past year, I've seen dramatic changes in his growth in that area.
Can you give some examples of that?
Well, his ability to size up a room, I think, is amazing to me. And I think it's just like the way he sized up the room of going to South Korea. I'm not going to tell him about my mom. That wouldn't be a good idea at this point, which I think was the right judgment, by the way, for self-preservation. He was invited to a party in New York, a party with my friends and people I was trying to get to publicize the book. And so there were some big-time media people there, and some of my friends. And I knew these people pretty well from having worked in New York. And it was a party, and then he was asked to make a few comments. And this was a small gathering of pretty important people, but there was friendly and warm, and people were having drinks and that sort of thing. And he doesn't drink, of course. He doesn't drink at all. So he started to joke about me in a way that he'd never done before. And he talked about how he felt oppressed for a while by this old man with a big head and a big shiny bald head, and he said it in a way with genuine warmth. And then he also talked about some of the important issues of North Korea, and it was the perfect after-dinner speech that you would think a gifted politician would be able to give, having smelled and feeled what the crowd is about. And that's what he can do. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This is not an average individual.
Okay. So one of the questions is exactly, I mean, you're interacting with him now. What is he doing now? Is he going around making speeches? How is he making a living right now?
Well, he does speeches. He just arrived back in Washington over the weekend, and he's going to be at a human rights forum there. He's coming to Southern California in coming weeks. But in Seoul, he's moved back to Seoul. He's happier there because of the Korean language. And he's got involved in a big Korean church. The church is really important in Korea. It seems to become increasingly important to him I think the question of a forgiving God, of grace, these concepts are very difficult for him because they don't square with what he's seen. But he has a social world there, and he does webcasting. He invites other North Korean defectors to come on and talk with him about their lives in the North and the difficulty of finding balance in the South, which is just a very tall order for them. And it's given him confidence, and it's given him a professional polish as a speaker that is quite impressive. And he's in a much better place emotionally, psychologically, than he's ever been.
Okay, great. So one question here is, could you name some or one quirky, odd, strange thing that Shin would do during your meetings that had foundations in his upbringing in the camp?
He never cried. He never cried. I mean, when he told me the story about betraying his mother and causing her death, and he also mentioned in that particular session that he did it also so he'd get more food and he could have an easier job. That was part of his betrayal. I mean, he didn't do it just because he was mad at his mom or just because he was afraid. He did it because as a camp-bred snitch, he looked for an angle for more food. And what was the point?
No. You answered the question.
Okay.
So what do you think or hope the book has done for Shin? And a related question here is Shin pleased with the book? How does he feel about it?
Yeah, he's pleased with it. There's one part that he was particularly angry about, though. When he was in Southern California working at LINK, Liberty in North Korea, very good human rights group led by young Korean Americans that does great work. They have a program for young people. Young people go down there and work as interns, and then they go out around the United States and they give talks about the human rights atrocities in North Korea. And they're a very, very good group. And one of the young interns who went down there had read the Washington Post piece that I wrote originally about Shin, and she'd seen him when he spoke to Google when he first came to the United States in 2006. And she thought of him sort of as a rock star of human rights. And she went down, and she's from Seattle, and she's young, very, very attractive. And they fell in love. And Shin was swept off his feet. And I met the young woman, and she is a real knockout, and I could understand. And that's why he moved to Seattle, because she's from Seattle. And but it didn't work out, and it sort of ripped him up emotionally when it didn't work out.
Okay. Is he in danger in any way?
It's possible. It depends on the degree to which he becomes the face of the human rights catastrophe in North Korea. And from the get-go with this book and with the story in the Washington Post, I told him and friends told him that this is possible that you could become a target. They have tried. North Korea has sent assassination teams to South Korea. They've been intercepted. They've been successful. But usually those are much higher level people. He's the lowest of the low. They routinely refer to human rights, to defectors as animals, as beasts, as inhuman garbage. Garbage is a word they like to use to describe these people. So sending a hit team to kill garbage is probably not consistent with the way the North Korean thinks, but who knows the way they think. So he's been asked about that a lot, and he said, I just cannot be afraid of them at this point. I will not speak out because I'm afraid.
This question relates to Shin's reaction to the United States and sort of your understanding of maybe what surprised him most about being in the United States.
Yeah, right.
It was interesting because he was a little bit different. He had no preconceived notions originally of what the United States was, I think, right? What you're saying.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of an interest. I'm sort of curious. So is there something that surprised him? What surprised you about, how he saw the United States?
Right. I kept asking that question because I'm an American and because I think America's so interesting, and how isn't it great to see America? And the truth is, he didn't really, it wasn't that interesting. What was really interesting to him, and he told me this story a number of times before I finally understood, and I actually made quite a deal of it in the book when I finally got my head around it. The most important moment for him in coming into his humanity after being in the camp happened within 24 hours of clearing the fence. He ran down a hill, changed. He found a shed, underground shed, where he found an old military uniform, changed into the uniform, and then walked into a town called Bukchang. It's a mining town, poor, dark, miserable. It's in the middle of the winter, January 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of 2005. So he's in this uniform that doesn't fit him, and he's skinny and dirty. And it turns out that is not a bad look for fitting in North Korea. A lot of people wear military uniforms and are underfed and ill-bathed and looking for something to do. So he went into that town in the middle of the night, slept in a pigsty, because he'd worked in a pig farm and he felt comfortable with the smells of a pig farm. He woke up in the morning and he walked around town. And it was that day, that 12 hours, that for him sticks out as the most revelatory moment about what it means to be a human being. Now this is, the entire country is thought of as a prison from the outside. But he saw people laughing. He saw women wearing brightly colored clothes, pink, red, things that he'd never seen before, colors. And he saw people buying stuff in the markets. He saw fruit. He saw all these things of human beings interacting with each other without fear of a guard walking over and kicking them in the pants or slugging them in the face. And he was just astonished that people can live like that. And that was more important, a more vivid memory than coming and seeing tall buildings and lots of Americans moving around in cars and stuff like that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. And let's sort of connect that a little bit, because someone asked a question I thought was a great question, what led up to his escape? I mean, here's somebody who didn't know about the outside world. He didn't have any, aspirations. He wasn't someone who had been on the outside and had experienced the outside world and they got sent back in.
Right.
This person's sort of view of the world was very narrow. It was, I want to sleep and I want to eat and I just want to get through this, sort of the day. Yeah. How did he decide that he wanted to get out? What prompted that? If he was so programmed in that way and he knew the rule was no escape.
Well, he was in some ways the luckiest unlucky person ever. When he was working in the garment factory in the camp, he was a sewing machine repairman. That's where he got his finger cut for dropping a sewing machine. But he was assigned to work with a guy named Park, who was an outsider to the camp, and Park was the first outsider that Shin had contact with, sustained contact with. Park had grown up in Pyongyang. He was a member of the elite. He had gone to school in the former Soviet Union. He'd traveled widely in China. He'd been to UK. He'd been around. He knew the world. And he'd run afoul of some apparatchik in Pyongyang when he was running a Taekwondo center in Pyongyang. And he'd fled the country to China, and then he'd come back, and in re-entering the country, he was arrested and sent to Camp 14, along with his wife, who was divorcing him, trying to get rid, saying that he was the traitor, I'm the good wife, and so he was very unhappy about his wife. Anyhow, so Park was assigned to work with Shin. Shin was supposed to teach him how to fix sewing machines, which he did for a while, but that conversation can only go so far. And then Park started to ask Shin a few questions. The first question he asked, he said, "Where are you from?" And Shin said, "I'm from here." And And so Shin said, well, where are you from? And he said, I'm from Pyongyang. And Shin said, where's Pyongyang? What's Pyongyang? He didn't know. And Park, instead of laughing at this stupendously ignorant young man, he started telling him how the world worked. So they walked around at night from 4 to midnight for about 6 weeks. And Park gave Shin a primer on planet Earth. It was round, China existed, South Korea, telephones, the United States, the fact that Kim Jong-il was a sleazy creep, information like that. And all of it was mildly interesting to him. But then Park started talking about what it was like to eat in China, particularly grilled meat. Shin began to dream about eating grilled meat in China. And after a few weeks of dreaming about grilled meat, he said, let's escape. And that's why they tried to escape together. Okay. Park completely opened up his world. And Shin says, I would like to say it was because of democracy, my thirst for freedom, my inherent compatibility with the Magna Carta and the Constitution. But it was grilled meat.
We should tell that to the U.S. government then, possibly. So I think we have time for one final question, and I think this is most appropriate. How did Shin and this writing the book affect you personally? And when people read your book, and the folks who are here right now, when they walk away, what do you want them to keep with them?
Well, one is that North Korea is just a terrible, terrible place, and it's right now, right tonight, doing terrible things to its people, and that they should keep that in their heart and make it part of their understanding of the world, and if they can affect change, that would be good. I think that's really important. And I think the second thing is that the remarkable capacity of this individual to have been bred to be a beast, to betray his own mother and not catch her eye when she dies, and his ability to flower as a human being and as a really interesting person once he got out. Mostly because of his voracious reading on the internet and his curiosity and his ability to read a room. I think it says a lot about the potential for North Korea post-Kim dynasty, and it says a lot about the human spirit.
Okay. Well, there are a lot more questions. I know that you'll be here to answer them sort of individually. So let me conclude and say that this concludes our program for this evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council and the Asia Society, I ask all of you to join me in thanking Blaine Harden for his excellent conversation.